Welcome. This is Natalie Yeadon. I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. For those of you who do not know what Impetus Digital does, we actually have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual and communication collaboration tools for life science companies. We help them with virtualizing advisory boards, working groups, doing medical education, POA brand rollouts, all kinds of things. But what's more important here is we really believe in Impetus that everything starts with a conversation. And from those conversations, we can work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. This is really the point, or the impetus, if you will, behind this podcast and this YouTube channel, is that we are having conversations, these big, hairy, audacious conversations with the provocateurs, the leaders, the people who are in the leading edge of things that are truly innovative and interesting and different, both at the leadership level and at the digital level and everything in between. So we're super excited to having one of these leaders in our conversation today. And so I'm really pleased to have Alok Kanti with us today. He has extensive international experience working in a variety of roles in the pharmaceutical industry. So super stoked that we're actually able to have somebody like him and of his stature joining our conversation today. He actually started his professional career back in 1994, and he has since gained a ton of experience in things like regional management, commercial operations. He's done a lot of work in strategic marketing, as well as doing things like country division management, et cetera. Alok has worked in a variety of leadership positions, including the regional head for Bayer Healthcare Pharmaceuticals in Asia Pacific. So interesting in getting a little bit on that as well. But since 2015, he has been the president and CEO of Bayer Inc. Canada. And so he's also on the board of directors with the Innovative Medicines Canada and Biotech Canada as well. So welcome, Alok. So happy to have you on the show today.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So very interesting background. We'd love to find out from you and the audience who are listening today. Tell us a little bit about the interesting trajectory. You obviously have this international background, a whole variety of things. What brought you to the position that you find yourself in today?
Yeah, thank you for that, Natalie. Thank you for that wonderful introduction too. Just want to recognize that yesterday was Remembrance Day, and we want to be thankful to all the veterans who've actually given us the peace and prosperity that we have here in Canada. And also want to take a moment to recognize that it's Movember. So it's for men's health, specifically with a focus on prostate cancer. And if you are so inclined and able, please grow a beard or a mustache if your family allows you, and or donate to the cause with them. Yeah. So thank you for that really nice intro, Natalie. Basically, it started off about 27 years ago, and Bayer, being a German company, has a kind of long-term view on employee development. So my initial training was really 3 years in Canada, where I went through nearly every function that a pharmaceutical subsidiary does, right? So from sales, marketing, assistant to my position. I did some work in reg and in product development and medical at that time too. And then in head office, I did the same. So I was then sent off to Leverkusen. Nearly everyone has to rotate through Germany in this program. And there I worked in strategic marketing and product development. I worked as assistant to the head of international, and I did a number of other projects in strategic planning to give me a comprehensive overview of operations of a pharmaceutical company. Thereafter, of course, you get into a kind of career path as a country manager, and you start off with smaller countries. I started off with Philippines, and then I went through the path. I was a regional head. I worked in multiple divisions of Bayer, since we are a diversified life science company. So I've worked in other divisions. And prior to coming to Canada, I was in China, where we have today, I think, a $3 billion business, or 3 billion euros business, about 4.5 billion Canadian. And while I was there, we had about 8,000 colleagues. And now I head up Canada. which is again a kind of return, so to speak, return home. And it's been great. I mean, I've had a chance we've moved 12 times. So we've lived in 6 or 7 different countries, 6 or 7 different cities, or even countries too, actually. So quite a few countries. And we were happy that we were in Canada while both my kids were able to finish high school, right? And what it does is it gives you pharmaceutical development and commercialization is a global agenda. No single country outside of the US can justify the cost. No single market outside of the US can justify the costs required to develop a drug. So you really have to have a global mindset. You have to have a mindset of bringing the benefits that your innovation brings across the globe, not just to the rich countries, but to people in the poorer countries, and that too to poorer people in the poor countries too, right? So you have to think of that global mindset of serving everyone, every population, and understanding the risks and the value challenges that agenda or that agenda brings. Yeah.
Very interesting. And so what a wonderful path and opportunity that was granted through that particular process. We're living in a really different world.
Mhm.
And nothing is ever going to be the same now that we're emerging. Or, I mean, that's probably the only word I could think of right now, because I don't even know if it's emerging. We're living through this pandemic. Now, with these opportunities that you were talked about, international opportunities, exposure to different cultures, economies, economies of scale, everything else that's involved with these other markets, what would you say to the leaders of today who are on that same growth trajectory, career-wise and otherwise? How is their path or career path going to change because of moratoriums on travel? And perhaps our new versioning of what global and the understanding of global markets means in today's new environment, is this going to be different for the leaders of tomorrow?
Yeah, I think it's going to be different in many ways. Firstly, let's go back a couple of steps. The question is, what does it mean to be a leader in a global context? Let's try to answer that question, right? And the big thing about being a leader in a global context is about being a driver of self-growth and self-development, and about being a driver for change for the better, right? So self-growth and self-development internally for yourself as a person, and then being a driver of change for the better for society. Let's take the second one. Globalization is neither good nor bad. It's how you globalize. It's the care you take during globalization that makes the difference, right? So you don't want people left behind due to globalization. Otherwise, you get a lot of, say, negative impacts. So the method of globalization is perhaps as important as the net result or the benefit that globalization brings. So that's one side on globalization as a trend in the world today, right? Now, the second one as a leader is the path of self-development, wherein you have to be ready for change. You have to be able to change old habits and challenge old habits and old assumptions as you go forward. So, for example, in my career, one of my biggest learnings was to constantly challenge my assumptions, right? And a global career gives you the opportunity, because you are set up in so many different cultural environments, that what might seem easy is actually difficult. So prior to Canada, I'd lived in 3 countries, but they were all English speaking. And I remember a server, and this was a major prejudice, I must say, right? Who must have been in Canada for 5 or 6 years, but she spoke grammatically wrong English. And I was like, she should kind of learn English now that she's in Canada. And then I moved to Germany, and I must have like killed that language so many times, right? Despite getting more than 120 hours of education on German, I was grammatically wrong so often that I just spoke loudly. That's all, right? So it kind of makes for your assumptions. You need to be aware of your assumptions and challenge them constantly, and that gives you the ability to operate in a different context, right? The second one is that quite often the context defines the solution to the problem. So a solution that works in situation A will not necessarily work in country B, but the questions you ask should be the same or can be the same. And that's where the experience comes in. Although you might get very different answers and different approaches because the contextual situation may be very different. So for example, in a country where security, where transportation, where petty pilferage of product is common, you will have a different solution to the same question, say, as opposed to Canada, right? So that's the second one. And you also need to understand a bit of the history of the country or the evolution of the culture to be able to understand the current social issues, right? So in Canada, we can't forget, for example, about the Indigenous people, right? So we should know a bit about their stories. We should know what the challenges are. And again, as a global company, know what is our role in the society, so to speak. So I think those were the key kind of lessons that I'm seeing as we go forward. I believe the world will change as a result of COVID, but they are also, which will actually bring the world together more, right? It'll become more global. Distance will no longer be an issue, but at the same time, the political world of nationalism and populism might drive us apart. So let's see how these two counteracting forces work together or against each other to give us something new. But we as individuals should be prepared for change and should be driving the kind of change that we believe is better for society all in all.
So some brilliant things there. And honestly, there's a lot of areas that we could take off and linger on all of those. So this is not going to be a political debate, and this was not, any intention of talking about politics. But while you brought that up, I mean, we would be remiss not to discuss the fact that there was just a presidential election, a week ago. We're still in some political upheaval, as well as a global pandemic, economic, unrest, social unrest, and all these other things. It's like a confluence of a myriad of different opinions, truths, belief systems, all melding together in a big mashup. And that we're all hoping that there's something beautiful and wonderful and a silver lining at the end of this big mix-up. So with all of that said, what does this mean for pharma in this globalization / nationalization kind of tug of war? Is there this opportunity, or is this going to be a hindrance or a help for companies to be able to thrive in this environment that we're finding ourselves in? And I think within that, there's this context that pharma has almost run to the front of the line as being the hero in some ways today. I think in some ways had really bad, reputational about trust and credibility in the eyes of patients for a myriad of different reasons, suddenly is taking a little bit more of that role of being a hero, especially as we're talking about vaccines. So really, to summarize my question is, we're in this melange. There's a tug of war between globalization and nationalization. And in amidst all of this, there is both the glory and the pressure of being the hero in all of this. What's your thoughts on how pharma is going to stick handle, manage, and thrive in this environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's take a couple of steps back. And I'll talk about my company, but it also alludes to pharma. My company is 156 years old. We've gone through First World War, we've gone through Second World War, we've gone through the oil crisis, we've gone through upheavals, in countries up and down. But what have we focused on? We focused on innovating products or bringing innovations that improve people's lives, right? Our vision is health for all, hunger for none, right? And because we are in agriculture, we are in pharmaceuticals, and we are in self-care. So long as you focus on that, you focus on what you do and do it in a way that is equitable, that brings value to the consumer, maybe the pharma, the consumer, or the patient, or the physician, yeah, and creates value for the shareholder, you're in a good position. Yeah. And both the sides of the equation are important, because if we don't create value for the shareholder, then it's a charitable event, but we'll run out of money to do it. So it's not sustainable. So you need to do it in a way that's sustainable, but you also need to constantly look for new ways of creating innovation or creating value for your consumers, your patients, and your growers or your farmers. And so long as we do that, and so long as we focus on that, we'll be in a good place. Despite all the stuff on top, of course, the institutions of the world, the science in the world, the ability and desire to cooperate in the world is very, very high, right? You don't get a project that is just run out of one country anymore. It has to be in multiple countries. So I'm not that worried about what I would call as a short term. It is an important trend. There are other people trying to address it. There are people trying to maximize it. Some people trying to address it. But you as a company focus on what you can do. If I was to take another company in the pharmaceutical, I won't mention it, but inventing insulin or developing antibiotics that saved millions of lives during the Second World War, right? That's the root of where a lot of pharmaceutical companies come from, And therefore, if we focus on what we do, which is bringing innovation to patients, in our case, farmers also and consumers, then that improve their daily lives, we'll always be in a good place.
I love that you really have emphasized, Alok, the idea around patient-centered health and patient-centered solutions. And I'm just really curious, COVID has been such a demarcation and a kind of an inflection point, good and bad, for a lot of different people. And certainly what it was an accelerant for change and a possibility. So I'm just curious about your perspective, since COVID, what you foresee as being potentially the future of clinical trials, and how clinical trials, certainly we're using the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, is potentially a marker of what this could look like in the future. But what does that look like moving forward in a global economy, with global stakeholders and with patients, especially in this idea around social distancing, and leveraging digital tools? How do you see clinical trials evolving moving forward?
So we can already see that there were certain trends that were happening in clinical trials, right? Self-monitoring, easy remote monitoring. We've even had to change protocols for site audits, etc. So for the general population, what would I say? I would say that clinical trials will evolve to have more patient-centric approaches, which will typically involve a lot more remote diagnostics and measurement, right? And which will therefore become automated to a greater extent, right? And make it easier, make the burden easier on the patient and the physician. Of course, what it would create is an infrastructure, a need for an infrastructure, a need for, say, digital tools that helps you evaluate all of this in a manner that is auditable and systematic, right? So I think that would change. The place where I must say that the regulators really stood up was in speed during COVID. So we sponsored a trial run out of Hamilton as the primary private sponsor And what would normally take 6 months or so was done within a month. I mean,
Mm.
Health Canada was answering calls on the weekend, they were texting, and they did not lose sight of their responsibility, but did it faster given the pandemic, right? But I would not expect that to change substantially as a result of COVID. They would have to go back because these people were working weekends and stuff at that time, right? So you can't expect that. But I think in the use of automation and digital tools, we've really made a significant move. COVID has forced us to make this move. And I think the good parts will stay. I think the question really for the future would be, how do you use these tools, not because it's an emergency, but because they're more efficient, because they improve productivity, and because they're more accurate, right? And I think that's where the benefit will be. Yeah.
So well said. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what clinical trials look like in the future. Will they really be regional, or will these just become global trials that patients from all over the world? So are we no longer going to need these regional centers for trials? It'll be very interesting to see what that looks like in the future. With that in mind, we saw an unprecedented adoption of telehealth during the really key acute phase of the pandemic, when there was so much that was unknown about it, and literally clinics stopped, or they were able to quickly get adjusted to the using telehealth. We're seeing that kind of dwindling down a little bit, but there's still a large percentage of physicians and other allied healthcare providers that are still heavily leveraging telehealth. And so during this time, there's all kinds of things that were happening. Clinical trials were stopping, they've kind of reinitiated. A lot of people were stopping, trying or leveraging new medications or switching. What do you sort of see as being the longer term impact if telehealth maintains itself as the mainstay at which new or sustained patients on certain medications are going to be managed moving forward? Is pharma planning that a regular drug launch will be a regular drug launch, or it's going to be just as easy to get medications switched or a new product added? What is sort of the lay of the land, or the belief of what is going to happen, that especially in light of that patients are going to be seen remotely as opposed to in person?
Yeah. So firstly, if patients are seen remote, so some of the changes in the short term, right, was because people wanted to keep a spare capacity for any COVID surge, right? And the second one was because people needed the social distancing and the hygiene factors, because those were the only tools we had. Now, over the long term, those tools will become less relevant as vaccines come in, as better therapeutics come in, et cetera, right? So that, I think, will be managed. But telehealth, in my opinion, is here to stay. It's just so convenient. I mean, I went to my GP twice during this period. I didn't go to her. She called me back, and I just told her my problem from home. She prescribed something and said, "Hey, if it doesn't cure up, then just drop by," or something like that. My next drop-in will be when she gets the vaccine, the H flu vaccine in her office, right? If I don't stop by Shoppers this evening or tomorrow evening. So I think that component of telehealth will change, will result in change, right? If the doctors find it more convenient, the patients find it more convenient, there's an efficiency gain to be had. It will take a longer time in Canada than, say, in other countries, wherein you have competitive medical practices. In Canada, it's more socialized, so change takes a bit more time here. In the States, et cetera, where you can charge a premium for service, there is a desire to, of course, change much more, right? So that'll happen here. In terms of, say, new switches, et cetera, of course, there was it happened, in my opinion, more because when we had the fog of COVID, we didn't know about its case fatality rates were evolving, all that stuff was happening. People wanted to be more cautious, but I think over time it'll come back. How we interact with the physician will change. How physicians interact with their patients will definitely change. And because this change has driven efficiency, right, it will be here to stay. If this change was just a encumbrance, it would not be here to change. But again, the change that we're participating in, we're seeing the benefits of. Wherever we see the benefits, is going to stay.
Fantastic. I love the positive viewpoint on it. And there absolutely is a lot of opportunity that's emerging from this. Now, with all of that said, there's obviously a kind of all hands on deck mentality part of this. And a lot of this is being propagated by the needs with COVID-19 and preparing for escalations in hospitalizations. And so there's a lot of people kind of rallying. And with this concept, there is a lot of push towards expanding the scope of work of other people besides the traditional prescribers. So we're talking about expanding scope with pharmacists and potentially other allied healthcare providers, potentially outside of the standard nurse practitioners. Do you see that as being a trend in Canada and globally? And how do you think pharma companies are going to change who they target and their marketing and education practices in the future?
Yeah, so I think that's a trend that we've talked about for a long time. And I think it would change as we go forward. Wherever there are, say, a lack of resources, or wherever resources are tight, you tend to get that change happening. And it has to be done in a manner that is safe, of course, right? So I think over time we'll get that change. And essentially from a pharmaceutical company's perspective, anyone who can write a prescription or change a prescription would then be someone we want to bring our data forward to. Because essentially what do pharma companies do? We do big clinical trials, which hopefully prove that our drug is better than the standard of care. And then we tell physicians about it, on a very simple level, right? So, and if the drug is not better than standard of care, it gives for a particular, say, customer, then we'd say, we look to see whether it is better than standard of care for a particular, say, patient group, right? A sub-patient group as such, or a subpopulation. So if there are more people in the decision-making, then we would have to approach more people, but do it in an efficient manner. I mean, compared to when I joined the industry, we had so many few institutions that were regulating us, right? Since then, in Canada alone, the whole idea of health economics has become so sophisticated. When I was here as a sales rep, we just started the team with 2 people. Today, our team in market access is about 30 odd colleagues, right? So you can see that these changes are happening and we would have to adjust to them. But I think these changes are evolutionary. So we would have time to adjust, anticipate, and adjust as we go forward.
You mentioned something earlier, Alok, around some of the unprecedented speed that we've seen some of the regulatory agencies, specifically here in Canada, it's Health Canada, but we obviously have seen this with the FDA and other ones internationally. There's certain parts of that are going to be scalable and others that we're just not. I mean, we're not going to be expecting people to be working 24/7. But do you see this being the launch point of how things are going to be done differently? Do we see an HTA process that may eventually become global as opposed to, nationalized in every country, where decisions can get made faster, quicker, more, aggregated with other national or international opinions? Do we see things changing with Health Canada in terms of the speed, the processes, and the protocols than what we've actually become so accustomed to prior to COVID?
I sincerely don't see too much change. I mean, if you look at Europe, they were forced to bring everything together and harmonize, but it still takes a long time. So unless you're forced to do it, you want to have that independent view. You want to, decide what's best for Canadians. Let Canadians decide that, other than someone outside your country. And just on, say, and the same thing happens within Canada. Let Albertans decide what's best for Alberta. I remember, if I hope I'm not misquoting the gentleman, but we have 7, say, financial or 11 financial jurisdictions within Canada itself. So the ability to raise money becomes a challenge, because you have to file different documents in different provinces, right? You have inter-provincial trade barriers in a country itself. So this is going to happen. It's not a Canadian thing. It's going to happen everywhere. And I think the regulators definitely rose to the occasion when demanded, but they would, in their mind, have a lot of good reasons why a Swiss person or a Britisher or a German regulator does not make decisions for Canadians, right? And although from a as a globalist, I would find that a bit redundant. If I was a nationalist or something like that, then I would say, hey, that's the way it is. That's why we have a separate Canadian dollar, because we want to have a decision over the future of Canada, rather than let someone else in some other jurisdiction decide.
And I think a big piece of this, Alok, of course, it goes in tandem with our reimbursement policies and procedures in Canada. You just actually mentioned 11 financial jurisdictions and decision makers. There's public payers. There's a whole protocol around, our HTA system, CADIT, PCPA, PCODER, CD, the list goes on. And then you go into, actual provincial and private payers. And it's a very, very long process. If you were to wave your magic wand, what would you like to see as being some fundamental adoptions, changes, innovations that would help to accelerate or dramatically innovate that particular process that we go through right now for drug reimbursement?
Well, a simplification of the process would definitely help. What Health Canada has done under the previous deputy minister also, of trying to get parallel processes to be kicked off, is also helpful, right? Global standards on HEOR and interpretation of those standards would also definitely help as we go forward. So there are a number of things. I mean, and then speed to access, anything that results in faster access for the patient would definitely help. Today, because of these standards, if at least, I'll be a bit conservative, at least 30% of the drugs, oncology drugs introduced in the US have not been introduced in Canada, right? Typically, Canada gets a product available to, say, 80% of the patients about 2.5 to 3 years after the US. So there are a lot of barriers for faster access for the patient. And I think it's important that those barriers be reduced as much as possible. So some of these innovations, especially the new round of innovations, are, without overpromising or at the cost of overpromising a bit, many of them are curative in nature, right? So whereas previously, I remember going to a hospice in Germany and talking to the nurse, and she said, previously we used to have a hospice for kids. So that means essentially coming in to die in a very nice way. And she said, previously we used to have a lot of kids with liquid tumors, but now we don't see them anymore because they can live. And this is in the life of one nurse itself, in her lifespan itself, right?
Wow.
So you see the benefits there, and the ability to get that access quickly for the patient. Anything that helps in that direction would be beneficial for us, I think.
With your very unique international perspective, I mean, Canada obviously has its glorious opportunities and certainly challenges, just like any country. What is your general thoughts around issues like a national pharmacare system, a place where there is, the jurisdictions or the around where healthcare money flows between provincial and federal, especially in this national emergency that we're in, and there's limited dollars and everybody is vying for it. We already see in Alberta, large layoffs in the healthcare system there, and a lack of funding. And really the concerns around things like pricing review boards and limits on pricing. Is there a concern for global decision makers to determine if Canada is a launching platform for certain drugs versus others? And what is that over longer term impact going to be on the patients and consumers of this country?
Yeah. So there's always a challenge because resources by definition are limited, right? Um, and Canada is a relatively small market. There's just 36 million people. And there is, although a fairly good infrastructure for clinical development, et cetera, and a very good infrastructure for hospitals and delivery of care, right? Now, as we make global decisions, the more complex you make a market and the less attractive it is, the investments that go towards there and the speed of access for that market varies, takes an impact on decisions. So for example, we would not want to, if Canada wants a lower price or has very complex pharma political regulation, it won't be a first country of launch. So it's currently, I mean, after the US, it is currently a second tier. And in the future, if it gets overly complex regulation, it'll be a third tier. You'll just launch later in Canada. People would have to wait longer because, not because the company doesn't want to launch, but because the systems don't allow you or create risk for other markets. So it's really a very tactical decision as you go forward, much as we would like to launch everywhere in the world at the same time. The pharma political regulations, the realities and the risks that they cause would make us a bit more prudent, and Canada would no longer be a first tier kind of launch country. The regulations right now of PMPRB itself, I feel, are a bit onerous, unnecessary and onerous, if I may, and they will distort a number of things. And the net result will be innovative products which benefit patients today will come in much later.
So speaking about innovation and what this looks like in the future, how has the concept of innovation, leading edge, cutting edge medications, how are these being viewed at the pharmaceutical level in terms of business models? We're seeing a lot of work being done right now on digital therapeutics, digital biomarkers, the way clinical trials are done. So there's a lot of digitalization that's happening. And these are being actually used as therapeutics, either as replacements of chemical compounds or being used in conjunction with to extend patents of specific drugs. But in general, there's a really core redevelopment of a business model that never existed with pharma before. So I'm actually just curious, from your perspective, what do you see the future of the pharma business model in this new digital economy that we're all living in?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If you look at the platforms for innovation still, I think you have gene therapy, you have regenerative medicine, so cell therapy. Those two will be the big drivers, I feel. Now there are platforms for optimization of care, right? And that would be the digital platforms, the optimization of care, and essentially trying to say delay the need for care also, right? And I think digital would play a big role there. As far as digitization of business is concerned, right? We should be 100% active in it. As far as digitalization of care is concerned, we should have our foot in it for sure. So Bayer does participate in certain platforms such as OneDrop, which may evolve in this direction, but I would say that's out in the future, 5-7 years ahead. But digitalization or digitization of what we do and how we make decisions and how we look at data and how we collect information, that is here and now, and we need to be 100% in it. Yeah, so you can try to, without splitting too many hairs, I mean, you see the difference I'm trying to drive here, right? So as
Absolutely.
a digitization as opposed to digitalization of care, right?
Yeah.
And I think we need to be aware of that difference and have two different strategies that drive it.
And I have actually always just marveled how quickly pharma has adopted to this and really, really been pushing the needle forward in a very innovative way, which has just been awesome. And I think just healthcare in general, I think we do need to stop and give some kudos and congratulations to the companies that have done that really successfully.
I'll take what you say. I just feel that we've been very slow. So I think we are slow. There's a good reason to be slow because a negative outcome impacts someone's health. So there's a good reason, but I still think we've been slower than other industries per se. Yeah.
Slowly but surely.
Yes, slowly but surely.
So with that in mind, one of the things that I did see that is happening rapidly is the adoption of pharma in terms of the traditional marketing and sales strategies that have been used.
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit about some of that adoption that you've been doing at Bayer or that you've seen in pharma in general? We've seen the traditional pharma-centric model or the pharmaceutical representative model where everybody had territories, they were geographically bound, medical science liaisons and medical affairs was done in the same way. Suddenly it's a big melange. It's an opportunity for one-to-many using a lot of these digital technologies. How has Bayer or what you've seen in pharma in general adopt the new way that information is being communicated and conveyed to prescribers?
Yeah. So I think where it has changed from, say, if I was to try to make it significantly different, was from a time of right message, right frequency, when your sales rep lands up at the physician's office, to again, right message when the physician is ready to receive it at a time convenient to her, right? And I think those two are the two, and in a format convenient to her. So essentially, what is happening on a very simple level is, whereas we had just one way of playing our game, we now have to change to different ways, knowing that so that people can, so that the physician is in the center of the conversation, what she wants and the format she wants it at the time she wants it, yeah, is something that we can deliver. So that's one level, right? The second level is, of course, if the physician wants it, but in a format without a person, right? So maybe a chat bot or a discussion through a remote connection, we should be able to provide that too. And thirdly is if the physician wants the information without talking to anyone from the company, just by searching on the net, but by using more sophisticated searches, our products and the indications we treat or the diseases we treat should come up. So as we do this, these are like the three components that you need to address, but essentially your tools are going to get more fine-tuned to be able to deliver essentially the same message. Now, there's only, and of course the message can't be canned anymore, but the studies that support the messages usually have the same information, and you don't want to stray too much from that information, right? You can't, you got to stick with what the study says at the end of the day, right? So message variability may not be high, but message delivery would change noticeably as we go forward.
I love it. I love the customization message there. And it sounds like what really pharma is doing is hybridizing it, is allowing people to pick and choose the channels that they're doing. So it's literally become the N of one, where it's become this uber specialization in marketing and sales, where it used to be one size fits all. So it's really, really cool to hear how that's evolving.
You call it segment of one and stuff, but essentially where the value will still be driven is in the quality of your data. If you haven't invested in long-term studies, if you haven't invested in real-world evidence, if you haven't invested in practice paradigms, you could do everything, but there's little value behind it, right? So it's a multiplication, so to speak. If you don't get one right, you'll be at zero. Yeah, you got to get those right. And the value of that knowledge that is created through studies is perhaps the primary thing that we'll still continue to bring.
So I want to kind of linger on that because it's a really key thing. We hear these days in the digitalization of the world that we live in, that data is the new oil. and that it's really up to us to refine it, utilize it to help with everything from population health management to, the uber specialization, being able to monitor and predict and do all of these things that we need to do to manage and to augment and to prevent disease and conditions. Part of that comes down to this idea of navigating and building and tapping into these data lakes. I call them eventually data oceans. And there's all kinds of ramifications around these data lakes, questions around privacy and security and bioethics and all sorts of other things, concerns about surveillance. What's your thoughts on the ability to create these data lakes and the way to actually manage them from a security standpoint?
Yeah, so that's a tough question, right? So the first thing I want to talk about data is well-constructed and research data is the new oil for me, right? So you can't go into retrospective, observational. You need to have prospective, randomized, well-controlled trials that prove a certain scientific question. And without that, you might be getting into murky areas where you might have wrong information, right? So you want to be a bit careful on that. I mean, we're dealing with people's lives, so to speak. So you want to be, good science is expensive and does take time, and you need to be able to invest well in advance to be able to get that, right? The second part is around data privacy, right? So that was quite a hairy topic for us about 2 or 3 years ago. There are quite a few challenges there, and the big one is proper consent is your safe harbor. Yeah, not some 30-page document which the person has to say I agree, but something that's simple, comprehensible is given, and then the person agrees, and that's your safe harbor. And the second thing about around the safe harbor is the ability to remove data is a safe harbor, right, upon the demand of the individual. So there are a few other principles around data privacy that is important. But for me, the safe harbor, the informed consent is perhaps very important. And then secondly is properly collected prospective data, right? Or properly collected data as we go forward, so that when we look at, say, statistical differences, et cetera, it is based on proper studies.
Yeah, no, it's so many important
In
points
many ways,
there.
less is more here, right? In many ways, less is more. Now, if I was doing market research, I'd look at data lakes. If I was trying to optimize certain things, I'd look at say, retrospective analyses and everything else. But where you're pushing for something, you want to make sure that your study strategy is scientifically accurate.
We are in a really interesting place, though, in a lot of discussion going on right now, Alok, around real world studies and real world evidence being an augmenter, if you will, of the traditional phase 3. And we have never heard more about this than since the pandemic, where we've had to start going back to looking at protocol trial revisions and all sorts of things around using things like digital biomarkers and sensors and other ways to collect information. And so this whole thing has come up around real world evidence, data sets, studies, et cetera. So how do you sort of see that weighing in the evolution of the way we do clinical studies? And I think really at the end of the day, this has become very much of an exposed question since COVID-19, and we've been talking about contact tracing and just sort of speaking to your whole discussion there around privacy and about being able to opt out, et cetera. But now with people wearing Fitbits and Apple smartwatches and 24-hour glucose monitoring and everything else, is these real world evidence studies going to become the new norm of how we quickly accelerate the experimentation, quick failures, quick adoption of new studies, and not having to go through these huge long-standing phase 3 trials?
So I'm hoping I'm wrong in my answer, but I think RWE, etc., observational studies tell you what question you need to answer. And in case there's no answer, they are the best alternative, right? The next best alternative. But over the longer term, you always have to prove something with a prospective trial. Yeah? And I think more than COVID and Fitbits and everything else, what will really drive the future of prospective trials will be the fact, will be around precision medicine. So we have a drug. At the end of the day, I think not more than 300 Canadians are going to suffer from it, yeah, from that condition, right? It's such a precise, it's a mutation, and it's a very specific mutation. If you don't have it, the drug's not going to help you. Although the presentation of the mutation would be in the form of various different sorts of cancers, right? But we don't anticipate a population of more than 300 in Canada, 3,000 to 6,000 in the States, 300 to 600 in Canada. What kind of trial design do you have to do for that would be the important thing, and what kind of trial design would be acceptable for that, right? So I think it'll be driven more from say the innovation in the nature and the precision of certain medications. For larger kind of studies, all this data gives you a lot of good data, but at the end of the day, you would have to do a prospective trial to be able to ascertain it. We've seen that in COVID itself, right? There were many promising therapeutics, but they're slowly being optimized or falling by the wayside in terms of their usage, right? Or benefits, right?
Absolutely. I think you've hit it right on the head. I mean, it's the tried and tested. And I think you do have to give kudos to Health Canada by being very methodical in their process and their methodology. So there's really something to be said about that.
And fast during COVID, for sure. Very fast during COVID.
Yeah. So I have two quick questions. I can ask you a million questions, but I have another couple of quick relevant questions. And that is, we've been talking a lot about digitalization, and we've been talking about all of these new frameworks and things. Obviously, there's been accelerated since COVID. But on the other side, you brought up very earlier on in our conversation about our Indigenous populations and some of the more vulnerable populations in society. We are calling this the digital divide. Unfortunately, people in our society that still don't have rapid access to broadband technologies, being able to utilize telehealth as an example, and being able to leverage all of the various other things that you might meet ample and rampant and available in more urban, suburban areas. Is there anything that Bayer is taking a stand on, or is trying to forge ahead to sort of help it with these particular populations?
So we see Canada as a relatively well-off country, right? And with a very good socialized healthcare and some very good social programs. Needless to say, there are weaknesses in the programs. There are areas that are not covered by social policy. And typically for most of these cases, most pharmaceutical companies in terms of product offering would give some kind of support or social support for anyone in the population, so to speak. So I think from a company perspective, from a Canadian perspective, we do have patient support programs for people who are not covered through either the social programs of the government or don't have private health insurance. So that coverage is there. For example, even during COVID, understanding that many people would lose jobs, we actually executed or made additional programs, right, for people who would lose their job, and then potentially the health insurance so that they could be covered on our drug while they look for a new job. Yeah, so that was done. And that is the core of what we do. With the Indigenous populations, we're looking for strategies around, A is around raising awareness, right? And B is around participating and encouraging, say on an educational level, an interest in science and the ability to work through science. So that's all that we're doing. We, on a global level, where you see populations of countries wherein people are so much more poorer than Canada, we do have a tiered pricing model so that at least more people can get access to our drugs. Right?
That's wonderful. And my last question, of course, that I do need to ask, we've just come out of a presidential election. And again, this is not a political debate about any of this, but from all intents and purposes, we have a new vice president-elect, which is Kamala Harris. We're seeing people breaking ceilings. We're seeing diversity. We're seeing at the same time a huge push around social unrest and a plea for more diversity, more diverse opinions, more diversity in social networks, working environments, board seats, etc. Do you want to leave the audience with your perspective personally on opportunity for diverse populations, and where does that fare with Bayer's philosophy?
So let me make a couple of statements because it'll be because the interview is ending. Is diversity is a given, inclusion is the choice, right? So that is the first one. The second one is you need to reach what you can and what you want, right? Society will try to offer it to you, right? And if you don't, or if you feel you're constrained, you should at least try to pay it forward. So try to ensure that the next generation or the next person doesn't face the barriers that you did, if you face barriers, right? And I think Canada, so that would be my statement really is, you got to strive for what you want. You got to do it in a manner that is fair, and that when you reflect on it, you say you did the right thing. And if you feel that you face barriers to your growth, right, you should try to make sure that the next set of people don't face those barriers. I think those are the two things you could potentially do. There are lots of other things that are possible, but as a personal action, if you take those two, I think you'll at least look back on a life with minimum regret or no regret, hopefully. And you'll be satisfied with where you are, I believe.
Lovely. I think a wonderful way to end this. This has just been brilliant. I could probably speak to you for several other hours, Alok. I love your thinking, very forward. They're so fortunate to have you as the leader at the helm of Bayer Canada. For those of you who are interested in connecting with Alok, we're going to be leaving his LinkedIn. Certainly be able to connect with him if you have other questions. And feel free to connect with us at Impetus if you're interested in having some of these stakeholder conversations. Sort of, many of the Aloks of the world having these asynchronous discussions, being able to gather insights about what you should be doing for your brands, what you should be doing with your customers. Come and speak to us at Impetus, like and subscribe so other people can find this content on our YouTube channel and our podcast. We'd love to hear from you, and feel free to check us out on impetusdigital.com. So thanks to everybody for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure having you, Alok, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, Natalie. Have a good day.
You
Cheers.
too.